Now, I'm known as the Storytime guy. I'm the guy that goes through the history books and looks at the weird and wonderful stuff that's happened in motor racing over the last, well, God knows how long, and it's got me to over 100,000 subscribers this year, which is a weird thing to consider. But I also do the current affairs stuff as well, and I was going to do a history video today, but there just seems to be so much current affairs stuff to talk about in a series that had the throwaway title of Pressing Issues, but not with Maurice Chavez, God love him, but still, Pressing Issues on VCPR and Grand Theft Auto was just genius writing. Not that I'm complaining about all this current affairs stuff. It's nice to take a break from the historical facts and go with what's currently happening because, well, you never know. A future racing historian in about 20 years from now will be talking about the stuff in the future that we'll be talking about today, if you follow me. I recently did a video on Mercedes' dual axis steering system, or DAS system. Who knows what other stuff will come out about that in the future? It's an interesting prospect. With a lot more stuff being on the internet now compared to 20 years ago, the getting accounts from people who were there thing will be much easier for people in the future than it is for me, because if you're talking about something that happened in 1970, there was no internet to put stuff on, was there? And if that person is as much of a nerd as I am when it comes to things like grey areas and exploitations in the rulebook that aren't strictly illegal but against the spirit of said rulebook, then they're going to have a goldmine to work with 20 years from now, especially when it comes to this particular thing, which is flexing wings, which are back in the news again. On Tuesday the 3rd of September 2024, I went online to check the scores in the Walsall vs Birmingham City football match to find that a complaint filed by Red Bull had been rejected by the FIA over these flexible wings. But it's not just Red Bull that have complained. Ferrari has also filed some queries about these things and how one team might have been using them to gain an ungodly amount of performance over the last 6 months or so. I'm really getting my money's worth out of these Wikipedia Commons images of the RB20 and this year's McLaren, aren't I? Because it's like that Harry Potter meme. Why is it always you three? Well, two in this case, because the big talking points over the summer break until now have been McLaren's performance increase, Red Bull's struggles, and whether or not Red Bull or another team has been using some sort of asymmetric braking system that generates enough turn-in that a team can run less wing for more straight line speed. It has to be said at this point that there has been zero proof that a team or teams have or has been using this particular system or a similar system, but people are still adamant that something has been used that has now gone away, and that's been the result of Red Bull's lack of performance in recent races. But still, there's been zero proof, but it is what it is, isn't it? So what did Red Bull and Ferrari file their complaints about? They're asking for the FIA to double check the wings on the McLaren and the Mercedes because the teams from Milton Keynes and Maranello reckon that they are flexing far too much and are an attempt at getting around the rules regarding how much these wings can bend. So, physics lesson. Sort of. The wings are going to bend. There's always going to be some flex, and this will be by design because the teams need some structural integrity in the wing to be safe under the extreme loads that a Formula 1 car produces. Put into simple terms, with topside aero, air rushes over the wings and pushes the car into the ground. Simple stuff, really. Well, simplified stuff at least. The faster you go, the more downforce is produced, and this means better performance in corners. If you're not driving fast enough, you're not going to get the benefits. This also happens in the aviation industry. The wings on an aircraft flex and will look like they're flapping in turbulence, but that's by design. If they don't flex, they'll snap off from the loads being too high, and nobody wants that at 37,000 feet over the remotest parts of the Pacific or Atlantic Ocean. I have the A380 fly over my house most Wednesday lunchtimes, and it's amazing how that thing stays in the air. The 747 is the queen of the skies, but why be a queen when you could be a goddess? Now, these questions raised by Red Bull and Ferrari do seem legitimate because what it seems that Mercedes and McLaren are doing is they're not exactly breaking the rules, but going against the spirit of the rules by doing a little bit of trickery. So, another aerodynamics lesson, but simplified because I have an audio engineering degree and not an aeronautical engineering degree. What McLaren and Mercedes have done here is they've created a sort of, I don't know how to put this, but kind of a mini DRS on the front wing. Something that when the car is standing still passes all the load tests and stress tests, but when it's on the track, where unless you're Superman you're not going to be getting anywhere near close enough to have a look at it, it's completely legal by virtue of it being impossible to tell. Mercedes already had a double DRS system back in 2012, when they rigged their cars up to not only open up the flap at the rear, but they hooked it up so it stalled the front wing at the same time without actually moving the front wing, and this gave them a bit of a straight line boost. It worked in the early part of the season, giving Rosberg a win in China, but because of the complexity of the system, it made front wing development difficult because everything was built around this specific system. The long story short of all this is, Mercedes and McLaren's wing looks like this when the car is standing still, but when the speed increases to a certain point, the rearward flaps closest to the tyre start to flatten off, which reduces drag and gives the car a straight line boost. When the driver hits the brakes and the car goes down below a certain speed, the wing is where it, in inverted commas, should be. What that in turn means is, if you get everything balanced correctly, you'll get all the performance exactly when you need it. Because if you take the wing off normally, you'll encounter understeer because the diffuser and rear wing are producing too much downforce relative to the front. Crank the front wing up and you'll have better turn-in at the expense of top speed, but you can also make the rear end unstable if there's too much. But if you develop a front wing that'll flatten off at 160 miles an hour and then go back to where you need it for the corners, you not only get better turning for the corner because it's where you initially set the wing, but the added drag below 160 means improved braking performance at the same time. But what if I was to tell you that this isn't a new idea? Back in the early days of wings, when teams were running the tall rear wings that broke off in a stiff breeze and trying to catch up to Colin Chapman and Lotus, they found that the drag was a little too much at some circuits. The Nürburgring being a prime example with that massive straight it has at the Döttinger Höhe. Lotus, and maybe a couple of other teams as well, installed hinges on the front wings coupled to incredibly stiff springs, that for 98% of the track meant that the wing was turned up for front end downforce. But once it got above, say, 150 miles an hour on the Döttinger Höhe, the rushing wind over the wing folded those flaps down. That's what McLaren and Mercedes are thought to be doing, so do Ferrari and Red Bull have a case? And how does the FIA check all this anyway? What happens is the FIA loads the front wing up with 60 newtons of force at a certain point on the front wing. If the wing flexes less than 3mm, it's kosher and off they go. Mercedes and McLaren have probably got around this by having a part of the wing where the flex isn't checked, flex more, dodging that part of the rulebook. See also Ferrari with that barge board that was illegal but then legal again at the 1999 Malaysian Grand Prix. The FIA was measuring from the wrong point the whole time, so they made the point where it wasn't measured bigger. But the FIA was actually already on the case, away from Red Bull and Ferrari's queries. At the Belgian Grand Prix they installed extra cameras on the cars that point directly at the front wing, so they can monitor the amount of flex on each of the cars. The cameras are located in the nose of the car and face outwards across the front wing plates, rather than the standard TV cameras that look either forward or backward, so the FIA can see the whole wing and exactly what it's doing. But this isn't to clamp down on stuff that's happening this year or maybe even into next year. They're basically just trying to get everything sorted for the 2026 regulations, so this is basically them going, oh okay, they're doing this and this, we'll stamp that out in 2026. That kind of rhymes, doesn't it? As for Red Bull, this might seem a bit like someone in a glass house chucking stuff about, to paraphrase Carl Pilkington, because in 2021, Red Bull was often found with wings that were doing the same thing, only that their wings flexed downwards to be closer to the ground and produce more downforce. Something like this also happened in around 2011 and 2013 because they were trying to get more downforce out the front wings. The wings in the late 90s and into the early 2000s used to be pretty low until these were changed in 2005 in a bid to cut down on downforce. Basically, the wings had to be higher, but because the FIA said only the end plates had to be higher, the teams started running wings with these U-shaped channels in the middle, which allowed them to still shove massive amounts of air under the car. And Horner said earlier in the season, the way that the front wings are being used are quite different. If you look at the front wing angle of McLaren and Mercedes, they're very, very different to the rest of the grid. In 2021, around Baku time, there was a change to the front wing regulations. Even though our wings passed the tests, it was exploiting aeroelasticity. The regulations are very clear, but that's an FIA issue, so obviously there's a test you pass and then you have to look at the wording of the regulations. That wording comes in Article 3.3.2 of the technical regulations, which states that all aerodynamic components or bodywork influencing the car's aerodynamic performance must be rigidly secured and immobile. To an extent, obviously, because that 3mm flex is there for safety, because as already mentioned, if it didn't move at all, it'll snap off and potentially fly off into a marshal's post or into the crowd or get stuck underneath a car, and then that car will be in trouble. In fact, those front wings are so strong that even a fat bozo such as myself can stand on one and it won't break. I don't know how much load they actually take, but it's got to be north of 500 kilograms, and there's actually a video of Hamilton standing on the front wing of his Mercedes and just being really casual about it. So, I guess Red Bull and Ferrari have to join them if the FIA isn't going to say that this stuff is illegal. Well, it's a good question, because Scott Mitchell-Malm at the race pointed out that that's not going to be an easy task, for reasons I discussed on Wednesday. Red Bull is currently in a bit of a black hole with the development of the RB20. Something happened with the upgrade they brought to Imola that utterly undid everything good about the car that had won all but 2 races up to that point, in 2024 that is. The car was a 1-2 scorer at every round with the exception of Melbourne and China, and every upgrade, or update, they've brought since then hasn't gone well, and they appear to be in the situation of having to go back to the floor used in Bahrain and parts used in Bahrain to understand how they got it wrong and basically unscrew the car. Simply slapping a new front wing that mimics McLaren's isn't going to do the job if the rest of the car is balked. And if the rumours about Red Bull not having much development budget left are going to be believed, then they're not going to be able to do a lot anyway. And the same thing goes for Ferrari. Since their botched upgrade at the Spanish Grand Prix, they've been dealing with porpoising issues similar to the ones encountered by Mercedes early on in the regulation cycle. And while they made a stride forward at Monza with Leclerc whispering his tyres to the end while everybody had to stop again, it remains to be seen if any real progress has been made, given that Monza is a relatively smooth track compared to Baku, where they'll be next weekend. If Ferrari has indeed reduced the porpoising and now has a stable car, they probably could bring a new front wing similar to Mercedes and McLaren's, but it depends on whether they need to or not. Because if the porpoising has been reduced to the point that they're able to consistently be ahead of Red Bull, then they can allocate the budgets elsewhere. And one of the articles I've read today to put this video together suggests that Mercedes were initially suspect about McLaren's wing, but then started looking into their own instead of going to the FIA about it. And what that's allowed Mercedes to do is to get into a position to take 3 wins this season. Yeah, alright, one of those was because the 2 lead drivers collided, but still, you miss 100% of the shots you don't take. Mercedes has had 4 specs of front wing up to the June of this year, when they dropped the design that they had to pursue something closer to what McLaren was using, and that wing debuted in Montreal. The idea with the newer design or designs of this wing is due to these specs of cars wanting to be run as close to the ground as possible, so they're trying to get it to run as low as possible but still have all the other bits and pieces that they need it to do. Like roll through the corners, and Mercedes had a car that didn't want to turn in slow corners, and overall it was an attempt at producing less lift. In fact, James Allison, when this new wing debuted in Canada, ended up saying that Mercedes had cottoned on to what other teams were doing, but never explicitly said what it was Mercedes and those other teams were doing. And with McLaren and Mercedes having the fingers pointed at them by Red Bull and Ferrari, it now starts to make sense. They saw McLaren's front wing and went, bingo, in German. So it seems then that the FIA is just looking at this to get things going for 2026, shutting any grey areas, loopholes and anything else early, so that the 2026 regulations can be locked in and ready to go with everybody on the same playing field. The tests on the cars are going to continue through until Singapore, but the FIA reserves the right to run more tests if they have to, with the run to Singapore being so that every team will run the cameras while they have a look at every team's front wing while they're actually out on track. Will they bring in a short-term fix for all of this? That's looking unlikely, but according to the FIA, this will make sure that they can draw the most objective picture of the situation and quantify differences between the various dynamic patterns observed on track. Their words, not mine. I probably should just clarify the wording that the FIA has used here, because the FIA does like to write in legalese and it can get confusing. Short term means this year, 2024. Medium term means 2025, and long term is 2026 and beyond. While the FIA has said that a short term, i.e. this season ban of the wings is unlikely, they are open to a medium term solution and are evaluating. McLaren already had their brake ducts protested by Red Bull at the Hungarian Grand Prix, but the recent Italian Grand Prix really did show that McLaren's wings were oscillating and bending more than normal, or what could actually be considered normal. Those wings were going ham around there. But in turn, this poses how the wording of that rule about the flex is interpreted, because if it's too stiff, it snaps under load. That's a safety issue, and if it bends too much, it's illegal. Where do you draw the line between the flex and what is causing it? Because on a bumpy circuit or over curbs, the front wing is going to flap around quite a bit and go beyond what is deemed legal. The same way that an aircraft's wings will flex on takeoff, but will look like the thing is flapping like a bird once it enters some heavy turbulence. I guess for the FIA, it's a case of the cause and or the intent of that flex. Is that because of a bump, or did the team design it with the express intention of it bending like that? See also the debate around the Brabham fan car. We all know that that fan was there to suck the car to the ground and produce downforce, but Gordon Murray proved to the FIA that the fan did more to cool the engine than it did to suck the car to the ground, and for that reason the BT46 was allowed to race, despite the protests from Colin Chapman and Lotus. The teams and the FIA are probably going to have to work together to a compromise because, well, let's face it, you can't fight the laws of physics. You'd run into a debate over, well, that wing flexed too much, but the car ran over a curb. It jolted the thing pretty hard. So at least for the time being, the wings are legal. But are they, in your opinion? Have Mercedes and McLaren stumbled onto something, or do Red Bull and Ferrari have a point? And should the other teams just try to copy them with only, 8 races left in the season, or should they just focus on next year's cars instead? Let me know down in the comments and get a discussion going. So then, a look at the flexing wing debacle that has returned once again. If this has given you food for thought and you think I've made some interesting points, do drop a like on this video so I know a good job was done. And if you want to take our relationship to the next level, subscribe and consider ringing that bell so you never miss out on anything else I do around here. Massive thanks as ever go out to the mad lads at Patreon that continue to support me at a more personal level, and if you want to help with covering costs of images and stuff like that, a link to Patreon is in the description, along with links to Discord, socials and other bits and bobs you might want or need to know, as well as some affiliate links if you need to get your hands on some F1 stuff or car parts. There's also Super Thanks, which is the best way of doing a one and done donation, or there's memberships if you want to support but not do the whole Patreon thing. So until next time, I've been AdmiralLaWind, have a great day wherever you are, and goodbye.